Hello, my name's Tom Richardson. Today I'm talking about mountaineering in Mongolia, a place that I've visited 11 times over the last 20 years, climbing and trekking in the remote mountains in the west and the north, mostly leading groups for KE adventure travel. When I'm not working for KE, which is most of the year, I work in Outside in Hathersage, the famous outdoor shop in the heart of the Peak District. That was actually voted the best independent outdoor retailer in the UK in 2020. When we think of Mongolia, if we think of it at all, we often think of it as rolling plains with perhaps nomadic people on it, herding yaks, that sort of thing. And that's true, it is like that. But it's also many other things as well. Here we can see the boundary of the country, and to the north we have what is now Russia, former Soviet Union. To the south we have China, but to the far western end of the country, as you can see the darker colour there, there's a lot of mountains spreading on towards Kazakhstan, and the mountains reach up to about 4,000 meters, so about the same size as the Alps, except there's no roads, no access, no facilities at all. There's also no large-scale maps either, and this is a map that I drew of the area in 2006, where I briefly had a loan of the Russian military map, which is another story. And this is the area we visit. The highest mountain there is Mountaineering, which is 4,300 meters, but there's quite a lot of other 4,000 meter peaks. But as you see, there's no roads, no tracks in there at all. We begin our adventure in Ulaanbaatar, the capital, right in the center of the country. Ulaanbaatar was built by the Soviet Union, and this pink building in the middle, that's the former opera house. Well, it's the opera house still, built by them. You see the star above the doorway. And they built the power stations and the housing and everything else, because until that time, most of the population was just nomadic. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the population, the Soviet population withdrew. And for a decade or so, the country went through very difficult times, and then rich mineral deposits were found, which has triggered an interest by many countries. These tower blocks are being built by the Chinese, but there's big British interest in there, and many other countries. So the future prosperity of the country, if managed well, is quite good. Lots of things that remind us of the past in Ulaanbaatar, though. This is the former Soviet Union steam trains that used to come through on the Siberian Railway, Trans-Siberian Railway, but with tower blocks and housing estates in the back. On our first day after arrival in Ulaanbaatar, we usually take a walk up in the local hills just to stretch our legs and get the lie of the land and get some views over the city as well, perhaps to shake off a bit of jet lag as well. And this is a hill we hike up called Setsegum, and for anyone who's visited to Nepal, you might have noticed the prayer flags in the background. It's originally a Buddhist country, so they have some of this shared culture. But unlike in Nepal, where you see either the multicolored prayer flags or the white katas, we have blue ones here. And Mongolia is also known as the land of the blue sky, and hence the blue flags. The next day, we take a flight west. It's a 4-hour flight over amazing empty country. We don't pass over any towns, very few roads, and just this wild emptiness. We also pass through another time gap before we finally make our landing in the far west. The plane we travel in is pretty good, actually. This is it, quite a modern plane. When I first was traveling out in Mongolia, we used to have to stop halfway and land in a field where men came out with jerry cans of fuel to pour in to make us arrived at the final destination, but much more modern nowadays. And this is where we land, the former Soviet fuel depot of Bayanugi. You can see in the distance on the flat plains there the landing strip where we come in, and it used to be a staging post for the Soviet Union. We're about 100 kilometers from the Kazakh border here, and we're heading out of picture up into those hills. There's no road to travel on. Working with us on every trip that I've been to Mongolia, to this part of Western Mongolia anyway, is our very good friend Sandagash, who's the local a local primary school teacher there, and in the school holidays she works with us running our base camp for the expeditions. She does all the cooking and brings some helpers along with her, so she's very much part of the team. Our first night is spent just outside Bayanugi, in these tents. You may know them as yurts, but actually in Mongolia they're known as gurs, and there's a difference. The angle of the roof in the ones in the background are gurs, and this one, the foreground, is more like a yurt. So we sleep in these, they're woolen felt tents with a wooden frame. Really great to live in. Weatherproof, warm. They've got a wool lining under the cotton. So we spend our first night in the wilds of Western Mongolia in these sort of tents. The next day we set off in a small fleet of these Russian four-wheel drive minivans. We take all our kit with us, all our food and supplies for the entire trip. There's no road, it's just off-road all the way. Beautiful country, wild, remote, and we stop off for meals and eventually arrive at the place that we say, without even a trace of humour, we call it the roadhead. There's no road. One of the places we do stop is here, which is just a rock outcrop along the way. And well, certainly in our culture, it would be a national treasure, I think. It's a wide area of rocks with carvings of all sorts of animals on them. And none of these animals exist in this area anymore. But I think what happened was in the last ice age, to the left of the picture, there was a large glacial lake, and this whole area was forested. And the animals that the people who lived here carved on this rock were all around there. But there's nothing like it now. But it's unprotected. It's just a bit of a secret sort of a place, really. The road is not easy to travel on. If the weather's good, it's not bad, but there's these mountain streams that are coming down off the glaciers that the locals are having to travel to. I think these two people are off shopping somewhere, about 6 hours on a motorbike away. So it's tough travel in a wild place. Finally, we do reach the place that we call the roadhead, the place where the locals pitch their gur tents for the summer and let their animals graze on the fresh grass. It's a beautiful place. Few things to say about here, though. You'll see in the foreground there's a wolf cub or young wolf there that one of our friends found high up in the hills, and they brought it back. It had been abandoned by the pack, and they're feeding it up until it's strong enough to return to the wild. Also in this area, there's more snow leopards and sort of snow leopard sightings here than anywhere else in the world. But on the other hand, there are also more Yeti sightings than anywhere else in the world as well. So you can draw whatever conclusion you like about that. The yaks here, you might notice if you've seen them elsewhere in Tibet or Nepal, they're hornless yaks, which is quite unusual too. After a further night's camp by the roadhead, we set off on a single day's trek from the roadhead to our base camp, and it's absolutely beautiful. Imagine trekking through the Cairngorms in good weather, but rather than it being 4,000 feet high, they're 4,000 meters high all around. A delightful day of lovely trekking that starts off with the mountains a little bit more distant, and then suddenly they're upon us. We pop over the rise of a ridge, and there, stretching in front of us, is the enormous Potonin Glacier, and the beginning of the peaks of the area. We're going to drop straight down, steeply down from this ridge, and camp by the moraine next to the glacier. The conditions vary quite a lot. Usually by the time we're getting into the camp in the summer, there's still patches of winter snow around about base camp level, and a lot of snow in the mountains. As the summer draws on into towards September, it clears quite a bit, but obviously there's still a lot of permanent snowfields, a lot of glaciers there all the time. Unlike in other parts of the world, we don't have to backpack ourselves, and we don't have porters. We use camels for carrying most of the luggage, and they're great animals for carrying heavy loads. They're also the two-humped Bactrian camels, which are much friendlier and nicer than the Arabian camels, and they're quite happy to carry half a dozen KE bags and a few cooking pots at the same time. I don't want to go on too much about this, but they've got quite nice faces as well, I think. Anyway, this is the base camp. The other side of that big heap of rubble or moraine is the glacier that stretches for miles in both directions, and we're just seeing the edges of some of the peaks here. And we have 2 gers there, one for the cooking tent and one for dining tent, and we sleep in these mountain tents at the base camp. This is a scene at the base camp. There's our 2 gers behind, and in fact the snowy mountain behind is also Hutin, and 3 wild characters in the foreground here that I'd like to introduce you to. The taller guy, he's on a slope, he's not really that tall, is Graham Taylor, an Australian adventurer and friend who runs our agency in Ulaanbaatar. He is known as being for being the only person to have climbed Hutin in the winter. Extremely cold. It's much colder than the Alps here in the summer. And of course they couldn't even drive to the roadhead in those times, so it's an enormous backpacking trip, wearing down suits like a Himalayan peak in the winter. So after a couple of attempts he finally did it. In the middle of there is my friend Aid Summers, otherwise known as the Welsh Nomad. Any remote corner of the world for years and years, you often bump into Aid. But he and I also, on the first time I climbed Hutin, he and I climbed it together overnight with 2 clients, and there's me on the other side there. This shot gives a good overview. This is a smaller mountain that we don't usually go up, but it's a good climb to get the view of everything. As you look at it on the right-hand grey rubbly peak, that's a mountain called Mulchin that we climb. It's a hike-up peak with a snow ridge, and our base camp is off right down by the edge of the glacier there. And in the middle we've got Narendal, which doesn't look like much, but it is a 4,000 meter peak, and it's a point where the 3 countries of Mongolia, Russia and China meet, so they can be stood on the summit and at the same time in 3 countries. And then the bigger peak to the left there, that's the summit of Hutin, and this is the massive Mountaineering glacier coming down. But sadly, even over the years I've been going there, it's quite noticeably retreating, like most glaciers in the world are. Anyway, back at base camp, we prepare ourselves for the first little excursion. And always we go up onto the glacier with a KE group and do a bit of glacier safety training for a day, looking at crevasses, moving crampons, roped up, and all those things. The glacier changes a lot over the time. If it's a very snow-free season, it's easy. But if there's a lot of depth of snow, you can't see the crevasses at all, and it's potentially quite dangerous, as I'll be explaining in a minute. As I mentioned earlier, Mongolia is a Buddhist country originally, and one of the customs of Buddhist people is when you come across a cairn, or a particular cairn with ibex horns on it, you should, or with flags on it, you should do 3 circumnavigations of it as a blessing. It's quite interesting though, because obviously it had the influence of the Soviet Union for several decades, and further west into Kazakhstan, the people there are Muslim people, so it's on the edge of change of cultures. So this is us beginning the glacier training. You can see very light conditions here, small crevasses down on this part, and a very light snow cover. Further up though, their angle increases, the crevasses become huge and potentially very dangerous if you can't see them, if there's several feet of fresh snow on the top. 2 things to say about this slide. One is, after we've done our glacier training, we stash all our gear on the edge of the glacier. There's nobody else about, it doesn't matter, there's no risk of it losing it. But to save carrying it back again the hour and a half it takes to get from the base camp to the edge of the glacier. So we stash it there, but you'll notice all this stuff that we're hiding it under. There isn't a rescue service here. This is a crashed helicopter that attempted to land some years ago, and that's what happened to it. And it's been interesting over the couple of decades I've been going there, watching certain bits of this crashed helicopter travel down with the glacier as it's moving downhill. Anyway, next day we're back again to the gear stash, putting the gear on, crampons, harnesses, helmets, roped up in small teams and heading off up the glacier, carrying full kit. And it's pretty heavy loads actually, because we're camping up on the high camp for 2 nights, and we're climbing reasonably technical ground, so we need food, fuel, climbing gear, tents, everything there. You can see that's the main face of Hutin in the background, and there's 2 routes we can see there. The most popular one is the right skyline, and there's also one on the left, but we actually climb one round the back, which we discovered a few years ago, and is a bit easier and safer. So here we are progressing up the Mountaineering Glacier. Looks safe as anything, doesn't it? Where the crevasses are all covered over by solid snow. But if the snow isn't good, it is dangerous. And you'll see we're wearing helmets there. And one member of a group once asked me, why are we wearing helmets? Nothing's going to fall on your head. But if you fall in a crevasse, you definitely need a helmet. This is a crevasse I went in 2019. You can't even see a blemish on the surface of the snow, and the snow's about 3 feet thick. So it can be a slightly nerve-wracking business after heavy snowfall. And this wasn't very far from our destination, the place that we call the high camp, which is that little triangular peak, not the one on the left, the one next in from the left, behind which is our high camp. So this is our teams are finally arriving at the high camp. It's a great spot, actually, in the middle of nowhere, high up on the glacier, wild conditions, a really exciting place to camp. We spend 2 nights here. One of the other bits of the adventure is I do all the cooking for the whole group there as well. So it's maybe high cuisine, but not haute cuisine, I would say. It's just as pieces of gear there. You see we're wearing insulated mountaineering boots because it is cold. Non-insulated boots wouldn't do at all. We're also cooking on MSR multi-fuel stoves, and usually I cook in the entrance of the tent. If it's warm outside, I sometimes cook outside, but usually it's too windy, so it's not possible. So here we are cooking inside the tent. Introduce you to another character here, an old friend of mine. This is Ushko Baya. Ushko is very famous in Mongolia as being the first Mongolian to summit Everest. In fact, I think he's summited Everest twice, and Denali. He was on K2 a few years ago, but he didn't get very far on that. But he's worked with us for many years and is a good friend. We get on really, really well. And interestingly, he only eats horse meat and I'm vegetarian. So that's always good fun, especially for cooking in the tent. When the weather is moderate, I do cook outside because it's just a bit easier and you don't want to spill or have fuel fumes or anything. So this is my cooking attire when the weather's mild outside. And I say it's rather basic pasta-based food, which I do delivering to people's tents. Anyway, to the mountain. This is the view of the face of Hutin from our camp. Several things to say about here. This is in 2019. The first thing to say is that you can see there's been an enormous slab avalanche right down the middle of that picture. So the snow's accumulated and swept the whole face. So potentially dangerous, even though the face isn't especially steep. The original route on the mountain is the left skyline as you're looking at it up through those 2 little rock buttresses there. The snow slopes themselves are okay, but as you'll see in a minute, it steepens up and there's a couple of pitches of climbing, and there have been some accidents on there where people have fallen off it. And about 10 years ago, following a tip-off, we discovered another route further right off picture, and I'll show you that in a moment as well. So these days we tend to take the right-hand route rather than the left, but we'll start with the left. So this is on that left-hand original route on some of the snow slopes, and obviously there's a good anchor point there before the steeper section on the rock buttress. It's not terribly difficult climbing, but as you see, you wouldn't want to fall off it, and particularly when people are tired on the way down. It can be quite demanding for some people, and it's a long way. It's also the way in which my friend Ushko I was just talking about, he guided the president before last of Mongolia up it. And there's a little plaque about that. And it caught on a bit because the next president and the next president all wanted to climb it as well, to prove something, I guess. So he's guided 3 presidents up this route. Having climbed that a number of times, we then discovered this route further right along the face, so there's a bit less steep, stunning views as well. So we use this one now. It's a bit less steep, a little bit less avalanche prone, and increased chance of success all round. On this route, there's no pitches of climbing. It's just steep angled snow slopes, gradually get steeper and steeper to just below the summit ridge. and then along the summit ridge to the final summit. So we're climbing roped up. Usually people have just an ice axe, rather than just an ice axe and a pole. And here we are in 2019, this shot, on the summit ridge. These are old friends of mine who have been on many trips with KE and trips to Himalayas with me, Marion, Sarah and Steve, approaching the summit. And actually you can see it's pretty cold there. They're all in down jackets and it's pretty windy. So here's a team being led by Ushko, just reaching the summit pyramid, just ahead of us. But it reminds me on the first time that I summited on Houghton in 2004 with Aid Summers that I was describing earlier. We reached the summit just before dawn, and we looked up and there was this red dot in the sky. We're somewhat suspicious about what it might be, but it turned out it was a space station orbiting the Earth. So that was any other sign of human intervention. So back to our 2019 ascent. Here's Sarah, Steve and Marion just on the summit. And I took this picture because you can see the clouds are rushing in behind us, and so we had to get the view before the clouds, and then we would be starting our steep descent back down again. Better views on a previous year's ascent. Views in all sorts of directions. You can see large peaks all across Central Asia. It's fantastic, and of course there's nobody there. No sign of roads, villages, nothing. Just amazing views in all directions, and the potential for new routes on these mountains is absolutely limitless. And then it's back down the summit ridge and down the steep slopes, and you have to take some care here. We're moving together, roped up, looking after each other as we go. If you look very carefully in the distance, Ushko and his team are off the steepest section. They've just got the crevasses to go, and then the biggest challenge of the day, my cooking back at the high camp. So here we are, the view from the high camp. The ridge that comes down from the summit directly towards us is the original route, the steeper one, and the skyline is our newer route. So big outing, big expedition, and if we get the summit, which we don't absolutely every time, such as a way of mountaineering, people are usually feeling pretty tired, but pretty happy and satisfied, and still keeping cozy even if an overnight storm comes in. So next morning we set off again. This triangular peak in the background, you can see there just with the sun catching it. That's where the high camp is. We set off again, roped up across again what looks like a very safe and straightforward bit of glacier. But I know when the snow clears, there's a lot of crevasses in there. And we're heading for the peak Narendal now, which, as mentioned before, is a peak. It's 4,000 meters, and it's on the junction of China, Russia, and Mongolia. There's number of little steps to get up and variations that you can climb, which is all good fun stuff. Great views down. The view back down that glacier is all the way eventually to our base camp, many hours away, but there's no sign of anything here. And here's Graham and his team just reaching the summit of Narendal. Just a walk up peak, so we've got trekking pole and the ice axe roped together. A bit of classic mountain posing on the summit as well. Yeah, axes in the air and things, but actually the foreground might be all right, but the background's even better, I would say. This is a very interesting shot. It shows just the summit dome of Narendal, and you can see one of our groups is coming down. But if you look carefully, you can see there's a diagonal across the middle of the picture. And that wasn't there when we went up, and there's no other groups, no other humans about, no camps, we haven't seen anybody. And what it was a snow leopard crossing our path. You could see when you got there. What it was doing there, I don't know, but for sure it had got his eye on us. I wish I'd seen it there, but none of us saw it. We just came and crossed back again, and it had crossed. After summiting on Narendal, we then returned to the base camp, the high camp, pack up all the gear, eat whatever food's left, and then trek all the way back down the glacier and all the way to base camp. And this is one of the views from base camp, the summit of Mulchin. Sometimes we do it at the beginning of the trip, sometimes at the end. It's a straightforward, still 4,000 meters, but a straightforward but steep walk up the moraine to the snowy ridge and the summit. Usually there's nobody else on the summit with us, but on this occasion, a few years ago, the Mongolian army had a training camp, and this was them all hiking up at the same time as us, so it was a little bit busier. but even then they were quicker than us, so they were up and gone from the summit by the time we reached it. So this is approaching the summit of Mulchin, just a little snowy, rocky scramble to the top, but with great views in all directions. You can see in the background there Hutin, where we'd been the day before, in the high camp. As we know, there's always the opportunity to do a bit of posing, and this is us in, I think, 2018, posing just before the summit. And here we are on the summit, little narrow ridge, great views. That's the face of Hutin behind us. The original route being that behind the right-hand ridge, now is in the far distance up from the col. So great viewpoint. Can either be a superb warm-up peak or a great crescendo to a brilliant trip. The views from the top of Mulchin are absolutely stunning as well. So this is looking down at the Mountaineering glacier and all the peaks just rolling on for miles and miles. You could spend a lifetime exploring up here. Fantastic, just to get the views. But you can still see down underneath all this fresh snow down the bottom of the glacier there, quite a lot of big crevasses. So it needs to be treated with care. And finally, we arrived back at our base camp, which without snow on it feels comfortable and homely and luxurious, really. And usually by the time we reach the base camp, the camels have arrived to carry the gear back to the roadhead the next day. Mongolian people don't walk anywhere. Of course, they're very famous as being extremely skilled horse riders, and all of them are. One time, many years ago, we used to get Mongolian ponies and ride ourselves back, but the Mongolian ponies knew that we weren't really proper riders, and so they were all over the place, and people were desperately clinging on while the pony did its own thing. But Mongolians have got really good control over them, and so they ride from the base camp. The camels bring the gear, and we walk. The next day, we leave the roadhead and start driving back across all the wilderness. There's a couple of little settlements in the wilderness, which is where the locals who are in their ger camps at the roadhead spend the winter in these small stone and mud buildings. And we've got some friends there over the years, and we often go and see this fella and see his hunting eagle. And they still use hunting eagle for not just for sport, but for catching animals and things these days. His relative used to have an eagle that was missing 2 talons, which apparently he said was lost in a fight with a snow leopard, but I don't know. Anyway, it's a magnificent bird, and it's great to feel a bird of that size on your hand. And finally, we drive all the way back to Bayanugi, that frontier town I was showing you at the beginning. Still got some Soviet buildings in there and grand plazas and things, but it's changing too. There's quite a nice little coffee shop there, and there's a small supermarket now, and that sort of thing. When I first went there was no supermarket, it was just a locals market. And this is Bayanugi Airport, from where we catch the plane back again, losing an hour on the time, and back to Ulaanbaatar, the capital. It's not quite over yet though, because after a night in the capital and having a bit of a celebration, we then drive a bit further out from Ulaanbaatar to this new structure that's been built. And the great hero of Mongolia is, of course, one of the great empire builders of history, Genghis Khan. And they're very proud of him. And lots of products are called Genghis Khan, the beer and everything else. But this is a magnificent structure made of stainless steel, only a decade or so old. But if you look in the foreground, you can see the height of a person there. So it's pretty large. And this is us all crowded into the mane of the horse, with Genghis Khan peering down on us and clearly disapproving, I'd say. There are 3 what they call manly sports in Mongolia. Horse riding is one of them, archery is another, and wrestling is another. So there's a chance that 2 are going on here. One of the group members having a go, as we said, not very successfully at the Mongolian archery. And then it's back to Ulaanbaatar, the tower blocks, the bright lights, the historical buildings, the Buddhist monasteries, everything that's so fantastic about the country. And we have an evening out. There used to be a very interesting jazz club at the top of this blue sky building, which is the one with the curve on it. So it's modern and ancient and fascinating all at the same time. So that ends the adventure. Personally, I can't wait to get back there, to explore new areas, to climb familiar places, to meet old friends, and have one of the best adventures that is possible in the world.